Attorney Lawrence. Good evening. I'm Attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. With me tonight is our ongoing co-host, Jane Faherty. Jane will explain her background. She's the director of Jumpstart program at the Stamford JCC. She's also a special education advocate. We have a very special guest tonight, Stephanie Mitchell, who will explain her background. And tonight's topic is primarily about post-secondary transition planning for students with learning differences, with a focus on college options and alternatives to college. We'll get into a little bit of that. Jane and I are part of an ongoing community. Jane, we've been doing this, what, 3 years now? Or almost 3 years. We're part of a community of concerned parents and professionals, and we are still learning how to navigate this unprecedented time that we're dealing with, that started with COVID-19, the pandemic, the shutdown, and the aftermath that we're still dealing with. We've been moderating a series of webinars to address a lot of issues that come up in these unprecedented times and try to address the needs that impact your child's special education program. And for this evening, it's the older child in special education who may be going off into college or post-secondary education. I just have a couple of quick announcements. And then Jane, anything that's new for you, please feel to add to that. It's sort of a good news and sad news evening for me. Since our last webinar, a colleague and beacon in the disability rights movement, Judy Heumann, passed away earlier this month. I've had the pleasure of meeting Judy several times early in my career. And for those who knew Judy, she was just this incredible firebrand promoting the rights of people with disabilities. She was very much behind the legislation that brought us the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The good news is earlier this month, the United States Supreme Court issued, to my surprise, a very favorable ruling for students with disabilities called Perez versus Sturgis Public Schools, that basically allowed parents who want to file lawsuits against school districts, in this particular case, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they can do that without exhausting their administrative remedies under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. It was a 9-0 decision, and that's, to me, why it was surprising that it empowered parents to pursue rights secured by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So with those two announcements, happy and sad, Jane, anything new with you?
I know, it's lovely to be here again this evening. As Lawrence said, I'm the executive director of a program called Jumpstart, which is located in the Stamford JCC, but actually we also have a new classroom opening up in Norwalk, hopefully in the next week or two. In terms of what's going on in districts, I just see that districts are struggling right now with a lack of resources, but that doesn't mean that children and parents are still not entitled to the services that are either described on their IEP or services that they feel their child would benefit from. Just keep collecting your data and keep pushing for the latest services you feel that they need and any other accommodations or supports. And don't forget to start talking about ESY as well as the upcoming school year, and use your data to really help put together the arguments for why your child might need ESY and what that ESY should look like. I know a number of districts are changing the number of weeks, the number of days for ESY this year. So if you feel that's not enough and that doesn't benefit your child, maybe try to help them think outside of the box and come up with additional solutions to help bridge that gap and those services that your child will not be receiving this year, which maybe they did previously. So just keep advocating and using data to support your arguments. But other than that, we look forward to our host here tonight and to learn more about the transition into higher education or other vocational opportunities.
Before we begin, just one or two housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded, and we ask that any questions be put in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the computer screen, because the recording will record what's in the chat. So if you want to maintain privacy or confidentiality, whatever's in Q&A is not recorded, but what's in chat is recorded. And we have many questions that came in ahead of time. We'll try to get to all of your questions. Feel free to ask questions during the webinar as well. So without further ado, we have Stephanie Mitchell. And why don't you introduce yourself, and we'll hop into tonight's topic.
Great. Attorney Berliner said, I'm Stephanie Mitchell. I'm so happy to be here tonight with everyone. I'm an independent educational consultant, and I work exclusively with kids with learning differences, ADHD, and autism. I worked for about 15 years in a private independent school for kids with learning differences. For 12 of those years, I was the college and transition placement person. So I've been doing this work for quite a while. I've been in an independent practice for the last 3.5 years, and did that so I could expand my reach and help more kids from all different schools and places around the country.
Thank you, Stephanie.
One other housekeeping, you'll see that in the chat, all of our contact information, and there are linkages to the State Department of Education and the United States Department of Education. So as we are talking about some of the publications that are coming from the state or the U.S. Department of Education, the contact information is in the chat. And lastly, for those who always want to know if you're going to get a copy of the recording, if you have signed up, you'll get a copy of the recordings shortly after tonight's webinar. So where do you want to start, Jane?
So Stephanie, I think we should start as a parent. At what point and juncture do you think you should start having a conversation with your child, and also with your school that your child's attending, with regard to transitions and exploring the different options? And what options are available for parents to begin exploring with their child and the school?
That's such a great question. So I usually recommend that families start pretty early on, actually, usually around the age of 14. And that doesn't mean you're actually college planning or selecting colleges or post-secondary programs that would be appropriate for that child, because there's so much more growth and maturity that's going to happen, up through the senior year. But it's looking at and thinking about all of the factors that go into transition, the skills that are required for independence at the college level or a post-secondary program, and taking an evaluation of those, and as well as taking into consideration the students' interests, their preferences, and areas of challenge, so that you have a number of years that you can start targeting the areas of challenge, promoting the areas of strength. And so when you get up to, somewhere around the end of sophomore, early junior year, the student is going to have such a great self-awareness from being part of that process that you can really start to target programs and colleges that are appropriate for that student.
So in terms of some parents might say, well, my child might not graduate or complete their high school education until age 22. At what point should those parents start considering the different tracks and opportunities available to their child? Would you still say 14, or would at that point you might leave it a little bit later?
I think a little bit later. I think that is something that should be determined a little bit closer to the traditional graduation date. But, usually somewhere around the sophomore year, I think, that's when some questions should really be asked. Everyone should really look at the student's skills. And if there's a consideration that the student should continue in public education to the age of 22, What does that period of time between the year that they were supposed to graduate and the ending of those services look like? And what are the services that can be provided, and what are the skills, once more, that need to continue to be developed so that they will be ready, or closer to readiness at the end at age 22.
And I should add that we are based in Connecticut, and the age 22 is the Connecticut mandate, which is not the mandate in other states. So if you're attending the webinar from another state, you need to check your local jurisdiction. Connecticut and several other states have age 22, many more do not. So make sure you check your own local jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I think in terms of working with the school district, if you have a child with an IEP, again, I think those questions can be asked early on, and you can kind of explore with them the resources that they have to help develop some of these skills and target them. Usually by age 16, they're creating post-secondary outcome goals with the student that have the student's interests and kind of dreams recorded there. And then they create goals and objectives that reinforce, help them to reach those goals. So that can include resources like transition assessments, any opportunities for, internships or vocational work, if that's something that's relevant for that student, coursework that might be beneficial for them as they, look to strengthen some of those areas. And again, I always like to talk about reinforcing the strengths that they already have as well.
And that's very important. The interests and preferences of the student, not what's available, are to be guiding the transition plan and the services. And that is through assessments, age and grade level appropriate assessments. I have many school districts that use a computer program called Naviance. Naviance is for everybody in high school. We're talking about specific assessments for students with disabilities who have IEPs. So Naviance might be a start, but it's not the ending point, because we may have to have a skills assessment, maybe social, emotional, vocational, aptitude, interests. There are all kinds of formal and informal assessments out there. And that helps guide the family, the student, and the PPT, that's what we call them in Connecticut. These are the IEP meetings for developing the transition portion of the IEP, which is not only focused on education, but employment and independent living, if necessary.
Lawrence, we had a lot of questions before this webinar. So I'm going to start diving into these questions so we can start to work our way through some of them. And in terms of documentation, I think one of the questions parents ask is, can my child's IEP continue to be used and transitioned into the college arena or environment?
That's the money question right there. So no, the IEP graduates when the student graduates. It is no longer effective after the student graduates from high school. And this is due to the shift in the laws. So IDEA also is no longer covered, does no longer cover students after high school graduation. But the 504, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act does. So, however, it is a different subpart than the subpart of the law that, that has jurisdiction over high school. So essentially that IEP and the 504 plan are no longer valid documents after that point. It doesn't mean though, it's really hard to talk in great generalities in this space because colleges will do things slightly differently and have their own preferences. So some schools might look at an IEP or a 504 plan as part of the documentation that they receive, but they won't rely on it exclusively. The other major factor here is that high schools have to create plans for students with learning differences who require modifications and accommodations for the curriculum. Colleges do not have to do that. They don't have to create a plan. They don't have to create goals and objectives to ensure that students will be successful. In fact, in order to be accepted at a college, a student has to prove that they are capable of doing the work that that college will, at the level that that college will be presenting it. So I think those are, really important factors and things to understand. And then when you look at what other documentation they're looking for, that question, that also varies kind of from school to school. It also depends on if you're talking about a support program versus strictly requesting accommodations. But generally speaking, you should have testing that's been done. You oftentimes hear within 3 years. That's not, a steadfast rule. It can even be within 5. So generally, if a student is retested during the high school years by their district, that testing should be valid. And they're looking for cognitive testing as well as academic testing. And testing that demonstrates where a student's capabilities are and where their limitations might be, why they need that support or the accommodations in place.
So if you
Question for
had,
you, Lawrence. Because the IDEA no longer carry through to higher education, can you explain to the families how the ADA helps students within a collegiate environment?
So that is how they're able to request accommodations that they are entitled to with appropriate documentation. But again, that looks extremely different from where they have come from. So whenever I'm talking with my students and parents, I'm essentially sharing with them that everything that they've known, it kind of goes on a 180. The school day, the community, the requirements, it all changes dramatically. So in order for a student to receive any support through ADA or the accommodations, they have to self-disclose. So that's number one. The school will not identify them. They're not required to do that. So the student has to self-disclose. And I get this question a lot because I have a lot of students who actually write about their learning challenges and overcoming those challenges in their college essays. That doesn't count as disclosure. So the admissions team is going to use that essay for different reasons, but they're not going to say to the disability services, oh, hey, I have a student here that, said that they struggled to learn, contact them, please. It doesn't work like that. So if a student knows that they, require further services, which is kind of a different topic, or accommodations, they have to self-disclose to the school what their disabilities are and make a formal request for those with documentation for those accommodations. The other sort of shocking shift here, I think, for students and their parents, especially after the K-12 experience, where their lives are very intertwined and parents are very much, championing advocates for their students. At this point, the student really has to take over the request. So, whereas some initial conversations with the disability services, it might be appropriate for a parent to be part of those conversations. When it comes to the actual accommodations request and the follow through with that, it's really primarily up to the student.
and that's very important because typically a student is over the age of 18 when they're in college, and that's the age of majority. And I've had many, many parents say over the years, I'm trying to speak on behalf of my son or daughter in college, and the college doesn't want to respond. I said, that's because we're dealing with young adults and they have to learn how to make young adult decisions. And then the parents will say, but they know how to send us a bill. I said, that they know how to do. They'll contact the parents over the tuition, but they don't want to deal with the parents anything else. And it's so vitally important that the students learn what I call and others call the self-advocacy skills, to speak up, don't assume, be assertive, and most important, understanding your strengths and weaknesses so you can go into the Students with Disabilities Services Office with the documentation, articulate and advocate for accommodations. And even if you get a plan of accommodations, it's not over at that point, because sometimes the students have to sit down with the professors and the instructors to make sure we're both on the same page. There are some, I mean, this isn't school, you know, the way teachers teach and the way professors instruct are much different. And so that's why it's important when you're looking at post-secondary educational opportunities, you understand the resources, their attitudes, the resources. You know, some have tutorial programs, some have graduate students, some don't. Some are more liberal with their accommodations, and some are just going to be very strict and do exactly what's necessary. And that's why the IEP has an accommodations page, which might be useful for planning for college. Evaluation reports will also be useful for planning for college and selecting colleges, because I mentioned some colleges are far more receptive to the needs of students with disabilities and some less so.
So a question to both of you. At what point should a parent or a student, a young adult, disclose that they have a disability? And at what, should they do it before they apply, or should they do it once they've been accepted to a college?
That's another $1 million question. And it's an extremely personal question, actually. I don't think that this is a question that there's any right or wrong answer to. And, you know, goes back again to when my students are thinking about their college essays. This is always a discussion, because when they want to write about their experiences, that is, you know, even though it's not disclosure that will lead to a connection with the disabilities office, it's still a disclosure that is optional. They're not required to tell anybody about their learning profile. I happen to think, and I have, you know, a lot of colleagues who have worked on the admissions side at colleges, that really appreciate when students do disclose through the admissions process. There are some, there's some evidence of, you know, potentially sometimes, you know, support classes listed on a transcript. There might be, you know, something else in their activities that they've been included, participating in, and things like that, that might, the admissions counselor might kind of think, oh, I'm wondering if, you know, they have a learning difference, and they don't disclose it. And I think they're oftentimes wish they had is the report that I'm hearing from that side of things. I firmly believe that, first of all, they're not allowed to discriminate. We'll never know if they have or not, but they're not allowed to. I happen to think if a school is using that as the reason to not accept a student, that's not the right school for the student, right? We want them to be in a place where they can be supported, you know, part of a community that's, you know, not going to be an uphill battle for getting accommodations, you know, enacted by professors. And so if that ever were a question, which we would never know, it's not the right placement anyway. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Is there a centralized database? So when you're looking at the different colleges, we had a question that came in before this webinar. Is there a centralized database for specialized post-high school transition programs?
Unfortunately, not really. So, and I think that, you know, research around colleges and support programs needs to be very thoughtful, and you know, we have to really investigate and ask really good questions about what they are actually offering. There are two sort of databases. One, I'm actually not entirely sure if it's open to the public, but there's one by College Bound Services. They have a database on there. It's for fee. But it's a wonderful database, and they divide up the programs. They identify them as LD or ASD or independent living and life skills programs. So I think that's a really great resource. And then also the KNW guide. A lot of people might be familiar with this book. And this book, even the author of this book speaks to some of the limitations of the information presented here. It's largely done in like questionnaire format is how they collect the information from the schools. So again, this is a great sort of starting place, but I think that the investigation, personal conversations need to happen, really careful questions need to be asked to see what what they say they're doing looks like in reality and practice.
And the phrase is reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications. So the accommodations and modifications are qualified by what's reasonable. And that's where the documentation comes into play. That's where if you've had time extensions throughout high school, you can cite to historical evidence. But there are some outer limits to what is reasonable. And that could be something that could create an undue financial or administrative burden. Usually the accommodations don't. I think often the obstacle is attitude, not the checkbook or the costs involved. So it's important to, as Stephanie said, you need to go to the college. You have to ask. You have to talk to the students who might be in the Students with Disabilities office on the day that you're there, and ask them, is this working? Is it a great college? The resources, online, books, there's a lot of information out there. And most important, the students and the parents' intuition and common sense. If it feels right, it's probably a good feeling. If it doesn't feel right, then maybe you should look somewhere else. Some colleges, by reputation, are noted for accommodating students with disabilities. And others are not. And so, sort of the grapevine, parent network, the Telegraph, whatever we're talking about, sometimes that's how parents find out. But I would trust your instincts. I would try to get as much information. Some of it's on social media, not that that's a reliable source, but it is a source of information. Some people may be have an axe to grind about a college, but you want to put it all together to get as much information as possible.
Yes, and disability service. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so when K through 12, we're used to having a free, appropriate public education, free being the operative word, and related services and accommodations and modifications are at the expense of the school district. What fees or additional costs or expenses do parents have to consider in addition to what you would anticipate paying for higher education? Might they have to take into consideration that they haven't had to think about K through 12?
Yes, that's such a great question. So I think aside from the regular college costs, parents and students have to assess whether or not they need more than accommodations in college. So accommodations are free. That is, they're entitled to those as long as they have the documentation, as long as they're reasonable and they're not asking for modifications. Those are free and available to the students based on the decision by that disabilities office. Anything above that is oftentimes for fee. So in order to answer that question, I think it's really helpful to pan out for a second and talk about what support looks like at the college level. So again, we've been talking about, the K-12 system where supports, goals and objectives and accommodations are all intertwined in the same document, in the same approach. And we've talked about the fact that in college, the services are no longer required by the schools to provide, and the accommodations are something that they can provide as they see fit. So we have to think about, does the student need ongoing learning supports to be able to navigate college successfully? So what does that look like? So there are 2 colleges that are actually created for students with learning differences. One is called Landmark College in Putney, Vermont. The other is Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. And both of those are college level courses, but with additional scaffolding. The faculty there understand learning differences. They're going to be more readily available to their students. And then there's also, extra support outside of that through a tutoring center that's generally staffed by learning specialists. Okay, so that's a really important factor there. Somebody just asked me to repeat the colleges. One is Landmark College in Putney, Vermont, and the other is Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida. So those are the only 2, believe it or not, out of almost over 3,000 colleges in the States. Every other school is a mainstream school. And I like to say that because a lot of kids, when they've been going through the K-12 special education, they say, I'm done. I want to go to a mainstream school. Well, guess what? If you're not at Landmark or Beacon, you're at a mainstream school, okay? But there is a small portion of those schools that have what we call a comprehensive support program. And that is a fee-based support program that is overseen usually by a learning specialist, professional tutors, coaches, and generally learning specialists are working one-on-one with students. And that provides students the opportunity to meet with somebody anywhere from 1 to 4 times a week for about an hour, depending on the student and depending on the college, to help them with what they need. Again, this model does not include that professional creating a plan and targeting, learning objectives with the student. They're helping them navigate college in the way that is best fits that student. Every other school, including Landmark, Beacon, and the schools with the comprehensive support programs, just have to offer accommodations. Most schools also have a tutoring center. So a lot of families say, well, I'll just go to the tutoring center. That's amazing. That's an amazing resource. It's usually free, but it's important to know that tutoring is offered by or provided by peers. So that can be a wonderful thing, but peers are not there to repair breakdowns. They're not looking at what's happening diagnostically and able to, potentially come up with a different approach. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. So when we go back to talking about the Landmark and Beacon as a result tend to be on the higher expense of range of colleges because so much of the supports that they have are infused into everything that they do. And then you talk about the comprehensive support programs, which are for fee, and that can usually, every school is different, but that can usually depend on the number of hours, the amount of support that the student needs, and so forth. So that is something that parents do need to plan for because it's an additional expense above and beyond tuition.
We're talking about college in the 2 or the 4-year college sense, but we've had several questions, a couple tonight and before. Where do we look if we're not going to a traditional 2 or 4-year college? And who's responsible? I mean, we have, PPTs, special education, that's part of the responsibility. And then that ends at age 22. So are there programs or ways to plan for a student who has a lot of potential, but may not be going off into a traditional 2 or 4-year college? Do you encounter that?
Yes, absolutely. So, Obviously, when you're looking at the public sector and the schools help in developing some of those plans, they'll oftentimes connect students with DDS and BRS, and that's in the state of Connecticut, to help provide services, vocational training and things like that, depending on what the student needs. But just like the, the specialized college programs, there are also private transition programs that are out there for students who kind of a variety of different scenarios. Sometimes the student is just not ever going to be college bound, and they need help developing activities of daily living, independent living skills, vocational skills, and so forth. Some of those programs will also have opportunities for students who could be college bound once they've, developed further some of their skills. They might have the opportunity to take a college course or two with the support of that program. So, a couple of the programs that come to mind are CIP, which is College Internship Program. And one thing I love about them is they have multiple locations around the country. But the closest one for us is in Lee, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires. Another program right here in Connecticut, two other programs right here in Connecticut are Vista Life Skills, which is in Madison.
Westbrook, but that's their main campus, but
Yes. Yes, I don't know why I just had a blank about that. And the other Chapel Haven, which is right in New Haven, and those are long established programs. What I like about those two programs is that they also are designed so that there isn't so much of an age 22 cliff. Once the student is getting to a level of independence with the program, they can move into independent housing and have, and work, use public transportation, and have reduced services provided by the program so that they can live independently with the check-ins that they require.
Have you had any experience with some of the transitions programs from high school to college, sort of a bridge, such as the Thames Academy at Mitchell College, or the SALT program at Arizona State, and many others around the country? Do you have any experience with those? And could you share?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like I have single-handedly sent all of the students to to Thames, or at least I've kept them alive. So yes, so those programs are really remarkable for a student who's kind of on the cusp, whether it's they're not entirely sure that college is for them. Their parents might not be sure that they're completely ready. They want to sort of try it on for size. And those are great because they're usually a one-year commitment. Sometimes students can stay 2, and they have components that include education. So taking courses at Mitchell College in the case of Thames, social skills development, community integration, and some greater support with independent living than students would traditionally get in a dorm setting.
So Lawrence, what should a parent do if they're not in agreement with the transitional program offered by a school district? What would your recommendations be?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Let's do you or Lawrence.
I think that might be more of a Lawrence question.
I'm sorry, could you ask the question again?
Yes, Lawrence, what would you recommend
somebody...
a parent should do if they're not in agreement with the transitional program offered by their district?
Well, the starting point is knowing what your rights are. And in Connecticut, we get a procedural safeguard booklet published by the State Department of Education at the time of our PPT meetings, We also have what's called the Transition Bill of Rights that's supposed to be provided to the student starting around age 14 and older. And there's also a book also available on the State Department of Education website called Building a Bridge. And these are the resources that parents and high school students should have available. The procedural safeguards are your rights. If there's a disagreement over an evaluation, you have a right to get another evaluation. The question is who pays for it. If the IEP is not appropriate, which includes the transition planning section of the IEP, there's what's called a denial of a free appropriate public education. Parents have the right to request a due process hearing, which is a formal administrative hearing, basically saying my child is being denied a free appropriate public education. And I would like you, an independent hearing officer, to hear my case and issue a decision saying the school should do more and the school's going to provide the exact opposite. We're doing everything to provide the free appropriate public education. Most of the time we find something in the middle of what the family wants and what the school is offering. And that's how I try to resolve cases. If there's a middle ground to be accessed. So if there's a disagreement, you can file formal complaints like the due process hearing request. The U.S. Department of Education has an Office of Civil Rights known as OCR. If there's a belief that there's discrimination on the basis of a disability, one could file an OCR complaint. And I might also add that also applies to colleges, but not for the IEP, but the discrimination. And the State Department of Education has an informal complaint resolution process. It's not a due process hearing. It's basically an investigation, often a paper review, looking at your documentation, looking at the school district's documentation, and making a determination as to whether rights were violated, whether the IEP in particular was being followed. So it's important to know what your rights are. It's important to articulate on your own behalf or your child's behalf what you're looking for. And we had, many, questions, on internships or other opportunities. This should not be a categorical decision. The IEP, including the transition plan, should be based upon the student's individual needs, not what's available. So if we need to learn about a trade, how do we learn about a trade? Reading about it, or maybe shadowing somebody who works as an electrician or a plumber or auto repair. How do we learn about college? Maybe we should have some experiences on a college campus to learn what college is and how it differs from high school. If we want to go into the medical field, the same thing. Have that opportunity to have internships rather than saying, oh, we're going to give you an entry-level job at a local retail store, which may be appropriate if that's what the student wants. But if the family and the student are looking in a different direction, that's what the PPT, the IEP meeting in Connecticut, is designed to do, so we can reach a consensus opinion. Ultimately, if there's an impasse and ultimately if there's a total disagreement, total breakdown, we do have the right to pursue a due process hearing. And that's why it's important to have all of the publications that are from the State of Connecticut Department of Education. ct.gov is the state website, including the Transition Bill of Rights, Building a Bridge publication, the procedural safeguards. There's a parent's guide to special education, and there's also something called the core, CORE, transition skills. And these are the expectations that we have for students as they are approaching their graduation, that they will have a set of skills to take them into their young adulthood.
I would add that the core document and the transition bill of rights are extremely helpful for parents to see, what are the ways that the school's saying that they will help to get them ready. And so if your students isn't able to speak to some of those things, or they're not really clear that they've done them, start asking questions and see what's happening. And maybe it's just a conversation of pushing something a little bit further, like maybe they did the transition assessment, but it was never really discussed, carefully in depth, or used to perform greater research or activities. So I think that that's a great place to start, so that you kind of understand the skills that are needed, and the skills that are being looked at for successful transition. Because it's a foreign language for a lot of parents. And for our kids, because I'm one of them, it's not just about academics. It shouldn't be for anybody, but academics is not the only conversation here. We've got to look at everything.
In that regard as well, what's your experience of students taking a gap year before starting college? Does that hinder their application? Can that help with the transition before taking that next step? In your experience, how helpful is a gap year, and what would you recommend them actually doing potentially during a gap year that could help them before this next transition?
That is such a great question. So I think that a gap year can be a really incredibly positive tool. And thanks to the pandemic, it's become a much more common occurrence. So not just something for kids with learning differences that might want to spend the year, building skills or doing whatever. A lot of kids are starting to take up the gap year opportunities. So it's become much more commonplace. My strong feeling about a gap year is that it should be structured and goal-oriented. So I think the biggest pitfall that parents can fall into is they're going to take a year and, they're going to do some work, and then they're going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and until they're ready for college. It never works. So I think that, if a gap year is happening, the first question is why, and what are the goals that, you're looking to accomplish in that year. Make sure that it is absolutely structured, aside from vacations and things like that, but pretty much start to finish. And to get to the application question, it doesn't necessarily even relate to the application question. Oftentimes what can happen, sometimes kids want to just finish out senior year, do their gap year, but then that would mean they're applying to colleges during that gap year plan. More often, kids will apply to college during their senior year alongside their peers, and then see how the cards fall, see where their acceptances come in. And if the school or schools that they were hoping to be admitted to have admitted them, they can go through the process of requesting a deferral. And that goes back to not all schools are created equal. Again, that's personalized to the school and their requirements. But that goes back to my structure comment. It's not only for the student to make sure that they're getting what they need out of that year, but most colleges will want to know why you're deferring, how you're going to spend your time. And we'll look at that very carefully before they approve the student for the deferral.
To add to Stephanie's answer, we had one question. If you take your student out of a post-secondary program early, or any transition program, what happens? Well, if you're taking your child out of a transition program and pursuing the gap year, when a student leaves high school, either voluntarily, they graduate, or they age out, that ends the school district's responsibility. So if you're seeking a gap year, think about this, carefully. Do you want the school district to be responsible for the gap year program, such as a transition, a bridge from high school to college? Or are you accepting the regular high school diploma? Whatever you decide, there are benefits, there are detriments. The detriments is you sever the relationship with the school district. I've had many parents say, well, they told me if we graduate from high school, we can always come back next year and get more services. And then they find out that wasn't true. So it's very, very important to know your rights and understand that if a student graduates with a regular high school diploma, there's no more special education. If they're still eligible, but they leave the school district for the gap year, for example, there's no more special education. So careful planning. Sometimes getting the gap year as part of an IEP is one way to go, or if we're just ready to move on. I just want to, I don't know, we have a couple of comments that are what's in the chat room may or may not be visible. We will try to provide information as part of the recording afterwards, but the two main websites that we're talking about is ct.gov, which is the state of Connecticut website, and you'll see the departments and agencies. And one of the agencies you want to look at is the Department of Education. And they have a lot of transition resources on the State Department of Education website. There are other websites like the Department of Developmental Services, known as DDS, and I think they're called the Department of Disability and Rehabilitation as well. And that's where the other agency, the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency that we refer to as BRS, which stands for the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services, is located. And then the US Department of Education is ed.gov. And that's where you'll find a lot of information on rights under Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they do have a publication, and I'm quoting the title. This is on the OCR, Office of Civil Rights portion of the US Department of Education, Students with Disabilities Preparing for Post-Secondary Education. And these are very valuable state of Connecticut documents and US Department of Education documents that can help parents and students know their rights and figure out a path forward if that path is not clear as to what our next steps are and what our rights are going forward.
What about, we had a question before the webinar, what about those young adults, for the parents as well as young adults? What services are available to young adults with disabilities who do not qualify for DDS or their IQ is not below 70? What pathways are available to them and what support services could they have access to?
That's a great question. I think that kids in that category, that, we need to create so much more programming for them. I think, first is that an assessment of whether or not college is an option. And then, you can look at some of the schools like Landmark or Beacon, where that can be trialed. Landmark, by the way, started a transition program as well called TAC, which is another opportunity to take, to live on the campus before committing to the degree. And then I would say that, a lot of the transition programs that are out there are, another place for kids who are, potentially not going to college, but can, not qualify for those state funded resources. Unfortunately, you get back to the cost question there.
We had a question on, is there data on private transition programs? And I don't know the answer to that, but the public ones, at least here in Connecticut, are on the State Department of Education. They have another part of their website called EdSight, EdSight. And the way it's set up is you type in your school district and you'll see what programs are in and around your school district. And then there might be another one at the University of Massachusetts in Boston called Think College. And it may have some additional programs. That one I'm not familiar with, but my able assistant, also known as my daughter, is sitting to my right, and she has given me that information. So I am familiar with the State Department of Education EdSite. I am familiar with some of the private transition programs, but is there a database? I'm not familiar with that other than the public ones.
Yeah, a lot of the, I was just going to say, a lot of the private ones are on the College Bound Services database. Again, I realize that that's a for-fee database, but they are listed there. Again, this is such a missing piece where there isn't one place that we can go for these things. Google gets you far, but again, you have to, look at the information that you find with a really discerning eye and ask really specific questions. And I would say for any student with coming from an IEP, or well, any student in general, but with an IEP or 504 that's considering college or transition program or college with a support program, they need to visit. They need to get on campus. They need to experience what that feels like. They need to have conversations with disability services even ahead of applying and see what that fit looks like for them. If they're considering a comprehensive support program, they should also visit that program when they're visiting the college. And those appointments have to be set up separately, because when you go on a regular college tour, they don't take you to see the comprehensive support program or disability services. So there's a little bit more thoughtful, programming that should go into place, but I think it pays off in spades, because then students really know and get a real good feeling for the programs that they're entertaining.
So another financial question we had before the webinar was, are there any safeguards regarding financial aid that protect students with special, that need the special services?
I'm not actually sure I completely understand that question, but one thing one of my initial thoughts is that you can use 529 plans to help pay for comprehensive support services. You have to transition them into an ABLE plan, but then it can cover those expenses. And I think, again, I'm sorry if the person's on here and I'm misinterpreting the question, but I think to me, the greatest safeguard is making sure that the fit is right, making sure that they are in the right place with the right supports. If those things are in place, then there shouldn't be a financial aid or expenditure question that comes into play if the student isn't successful.
And if there are questions about the ABLE Act or Section 529 plan, it's always advisable to speak to a financial planner to make sure you're making the right move, because sometimes there are tax consequences if you take out money that you're not supposed to, or you don't move it from one account to the other. I just wanted to go back a moment and just give a shout out to people like Stephanie, that, there are many college consultants out there that will help you navigate this uncharted world of going from high school off to college. So I just wanted to add that. I also wanted to ask Stephanie, is there an exhaustive list or examples of accommodations that one receives in college?
Oh, sure. Not necessarily an exhaustive list, but I can certainly give a sense of some of the accommodations that are more common at the college level. So I would say one of the most common one is extended time. That is usually time and a half, but sometimes students can be granted with extra time of that. That usually comes with or separately can be requested the ability to take a test in a reduced distraction room. They don't say distraction-free room because there's no such thing, but at least it's, you know, a smaller environment with reduced distractions. Having readings in accessible formats. So, you know, especially for a dyslexic student, perhaps they might be able to get the reading scanned so that it can be read to them. You know, different things like that, as well as a reader that, you know, might be able to read for them when they're taking a test. Use of a computer is often one that my students and I are requesting. Generally, professors don't mind too much if you're taking notes on a computer, but oftentimes tests have to be in a certain format or so they wish. So that's something that if your student processes better by writing on a computer, that is something to take into consideration. A note taker or receiving the notes after class. It's hard to get them ahead of time, but receiving notes after class can be really helpful for a student who's maybe a slower processor, might have a harder time listening and recording at the same time. Although I tell my students that doesn't mean they don't take notes themselves, because it can also be a great tool to help them improve their note-taking skills. But they have another measure to look at them and make sure nothing was missed. And then sometimes schools will allow for a single room accommodation for perhaps for a student on the spectrum who needs a quieter environment and would need that quiet time in between classes, so they'd still be in the dorm but be able to room on their own. So those are just some general examples. Examples of things that are high school accommodations that are not college accommodations are things like reduced course load. Reduced, how do I phrase it? Assignments, like, shortening an assignment from, a 10-page paper to a 5-page paper. That's modifying the curriculum, so that would not be approved. Another one would be sometimes repeating directions on a test in a different way. Again, that modifies what's presented to them. That's not an accommodation that's generally accepted. So as long as it's not a modification, though, most of what they're getting in high school can generally be available in college. I think that this is such an important, oftentimes we're talking so much about services, but accommodations need their fair amount of attention, because these are places that you can anticipate pretty carefully what a school may or may not approve. And if the student has a lot of modifications on their accommodations page, that's something to work toward with the students and the district of if they are able to scale back some of those things as they get closer to graduation, that will prepare them for that transition a little bit better than if they're receiving it all to the end.
The person asked about.
So I was just going to suggest something that one of my friends did when her daughter transitioned to college. Her daughter needed the support of a psychologist. So they developed a relationship with a psychologist a couple of years in advance, and that psychologist was then available and accessible remotely while my friend's daughter's in college. So when she needs that support and needs that contact, it's already with somebody she's familiar with. So while she's transitioning, getting to know new people in the new environment, she still has this resource that she's built the relationship and the rapport with a couple of years in advance that is available remotely, and they can access each other through a Zoom therapeutic session versus in person. So it's also possible to help with transition and change, to sometimes take some of the people that we are comfortable with, if they're able to and their practices allow and their certifications allow, to access them remotely. That's also been helpful for some people at this change that's taking place.
I agree. I think that's one of my number one recommendations when I'm working with students who see therapists. So first of all, making sure that their therapist can work remotely across state lines if they're leaving the state. And if that's not going to be a possibility, finding someone who can, that they can begin to work with before they leave. Same thing can go for students who are able to go to a college that might be a little bit more rigorous and doesn't have a support program. There are ways to source the support, especially I have a lot of students that need executive functioning coaching. They can get that externally, virtually, and to help them through that transition. And so when students are doing that, again, same recommendation, find the person in your senior year, begin to work with them through, the second half of your senior year. Maybe you do some check-ins over the summer so that when they go, that person is in place, trust is established, and they're ready to hit the ground running with the student.
I just wanted to do a couple of quick questions. Somebody had asked about the IEP and the goals for education, independent living, and employment. That's in the IEP. In Connecticut, we had a changeover from the old IEP to the new IEP on July 1st, 2022. A lot of us, including me, are getting used to the new IEP. The old IEP had one page called transition planning, and then you had IEP goals to address post-secondary education, employment, and independent living if necessary. The new IEP, it's all on one page, and it's a section called transition planning. So there should be goals and objectives to promote post-secondary education, competitive employment, and if necessary, independent living. That was one question. There's another question on financial aid. I believe the U.S. Department of Education website has information on federally secured student loans. So you're not going to a lender, you're going to the source of the funding. And you could see what kind of financial aid, what kind of student loans are available. My experience, which is by no means universal, for student loans, you have to be a full-time student, which is usually defined as 12 credits or more per semester. Most students take 15, 16 credits, but you have to take at least a minimum number. I believe that number is 12. To the person that asked the question, do all students with an IEP require transition assessment? The answer is yes, because the law requires that we prepare students starting at age 14 here in Connecticut, prepare them for their life after high school when they enter their young adulthood. Will they go to college? Will they work competitively? Will they go to vocational school? Will they live independently? And if they, depending on how those questions are answered, that will determine the trajectory of the student. Are they fully independent, going off to college with supports? Great. If they're going to need a specialized college, such as Landmark or Lynn or Beacon, that were three that were mentioned, that's another way of going. If we're going into a community college, that's another way. A bridge program, such as the Mitchell College or the SALT program. I misspoke, it's at the University of Arizona, not Arizona State University. These are all things that have to be explored as best you can with the resources that are available. And when in doubt, there are consultants out there, such as Stephanie, who can guide you through this uncharted territory, because it is definitely new. You're not dealing with IEPs, you're not dealing with PPT meetings, you're dealing with colleges.
Can I just piggyback something on that? I think it's also critically important because our kids have struggled for a long time, and that can sometimes result in confusion about what they're good at, fear of what they might want to try to be good at and explore, and an uncertainty of what lies ahead. And usually my students fall in two categories. One, they are 100% sure of what they want to do. I'm sure it's going to change midway through college, but they think they know what they want to do. And others who are just like too afraid to make a decision or hold on to something, anything in particular. And I do think it's because of the challenges that they faced for so many years, and this anticipation of this great transition that, you know, they haven't had to face in a long time in some cases. So I think the transition assessment really helps to break down the fear, to start the conversation with the student, starting at age, 14, at least by sophomore year. They should be going to their IEP meetings and participating in that so that they can start to become a participant in their education before we hand them the reins completely once they've graduated. And all of that can help to build, but without doing the assessment, you don't necessarily know what to build on.
And for the person that wanted the publicly funded transition programs in Connecticut, there's a section of the State Department of Education, ct.gov, that will direct you to EdSight, EdSight, and you will type in your town, your school district, and you should be able to find some of the publicly funded transition programs here in Connecticut. The private ones we've already discussed. It's getting late. We've tried to address as many questions as we possibly could. So I'm going to thank Stephanie for participating in this webinar and all that have joined us throughout the webinar. We've received a very large, tremendous response, and we're going to continue our Zoom webinars after this evening. We don't have our next date, but we will send that out to those who have registered. And as I said before, if you registered, you'll receive a copy of tonight's recording. I want to thank Jane, and I also want to thank my daughter, Rachel, who does all the legwork in setting up these webinars and responding to the inquiries, getting us the questions. And we will announce our next webinar soon. We just don't have the date or the topic right now this evening. We welcome your questions, and we will stay tuned to developments in the law, articles that come out of interest. And the most important thing is, knowing your rights and not giving up. A lot of parents just say, you can't fight City Hall. Well, actually you can. And that's what we try to do with these webinars. Jane and Stephanie, do you have anything you want to add to our conclusion?
Yeah, so I have some closing remarks. I was very lucky and fortunate to work with a young lady called Tova Feldstein, who recently passed at age 35. She was born with a congenital heart defect and had many other cognitive disabilities. When she was at high school, her parents said that they did not realize the capabilities of the skills she had, and they never really had a high expectation of what she would do with herself in the world. And she ended up becoming one of the most tremendous, wonderful special education teachers I've had the privilege to work with. And so I would just say to parents and educators to constantly have a high expectation of the students that you're working with, and to not place any limit your expectations of what they can accomplish and they can achieve. If they find the right environment and find the right support groups around them, you'll be extremely surprised with the impact they can have, not only on their own life, but on others around them. And Tove is a true testament to that. So keep striving forward, don't be deterred, don't give up, and keep putting pressure on the district to strive and help you strive to have the highest expectation for your child and where they could land, because you never know, and the gift that they can then give others is truly tremendous. So thank you.
And Stephanie, any concluding remarks? And we want to thank you for your valuable time and insight this evening as well.
Well, I so much appreciate being here, and to piggyback on what Jane said, you know, this transition process oftentimes brings so much anxiety for everyone involved. But I agree, I think the sky's the limit. And you should push for that and try to enjoy it. There aren't 50 million resources out there or options out there, but there are resources and options. So just, you know, take a deep breath and start to, you know, do the investigation, and you will learn how to align your student with the best placement for them and the best resources that can support them. So thank you for allowing me to be here and share some of my thoughts today.
Well, thank you. And good to see you, Jane. And we will try to get our next webinar out, hopefully for next month. And we thank everybody who's stayed with us throughout the webinar this evening. Thank you again. And good night.